The spice must flow. Hey there, folks. Yeah, today I'm talking about Dune. Not the new movie, though, the book. You're actually going to get a fair amount of Dune content in pretty rapid succession here because I was commissioned to read the book, check out the David Lynch movie, check out the sci-fi miniseries, and check out the new movie and do commissions on all of them. But you got to start somewhere. You got to start with the book. Except technically I didn't start with the book because I've seen both the Lynch version and the sci-fi series before. It's been a while, but what that meant for reading the book was I was reading a book where I knew the major plot points that were going to happen. I just hadn't seen it or read it in this particular format before. So it did have that slightly off experience that you get reading the book version of a movie you already know. And I am well aware that some of the things I'm going to be talking about are a reflection of the fact that it was written in the 60s and it's dated in a lot of ways. I understand that. But as I always say, I can only come at this with the perspective that I have. I cannot pretend that I have a different point of view or frame of experience than I do. Okay? Okay. It's definitely an interesting book. I think that's honestly the word I'd use for it. And I know that can sound like loaded because, well, that's interesting. And it can sound sometimes like a polite way of saying bad. It's not bad, but it is very strange and in ways that are pretty unique to it, at least in terms of what I've read. I suppose in some ways, sort of the elephant in the room as far as that goes is the fact that you hear the inner thoughts or read, like I'm going to mix words here. You read the inner thoughts of nearly every character. It is in no way restricted to a certain point of view, but it's not even like chapters changing who the point of view character is. Rather, you just get italicized, effectively, dialogue to themselves of what they're thinking. Now, this is, first of all, one of the things that makes it very difficult to adapt. Lynch went a really odd way about it. That didn't work at all. But I also get why he tried to do that, because that inner monologue is actually really important. And there is a reason it's written this way. It's not just a gimmick, because the vast majority of these characters, for various reasons, but they are not thinking what they're saying. They are in these political or religious or otherwise very tense situations. And most of these characters are to varying degrees very private and kind of closed off and don't let people in. So they don't have someone to vocally say what they're really thinking. And there is absolutely a disconnect and a juxtaposition to be had between the things they say and what they actually think. And this was actually kind of both a very blunt and kind of inventive way to show that disconnect, that juxtaposition. And it works pretty well, actually. For one of the, I totally get why it didn't catch on. It's takes a little bit to get used to, but because of the way these characters are and the circumstances that they're in and the way that they behave and communicate with each other, it actually works pretty well. This is also, I think, one of the more interesting angles on a Chosen One narrative, because I've said more than a few times, I kind of hate Chosen One stories. Not that I think they're inherently bad, I'm just incredibly sick of them. Partially because they're really boring to me. They feel like there's only so many ways they could go. As soon as there's a prophecy introduced, which usually goes hand in hand with the Chosen One, that means one of two things happens. Either the prophecy comes true or the prophecy doesn't. There's now only two outcomes. Whereas when you don't lay it out that way, there's infinite number of outcomes, in theory, at least. Granted, most stories fall along the lines of the good guys win or the good guys lose, but it just feels like it's artificially restricting a story that doesn't need it most of the time, for me. Why I'm more okay with it here than I am in a lot of other places is because there's a lot of weird layers and quirks to the Chosen One here for a number of reasons. Partially because, like, the whole idea of the prophecy in the Chosen One isn't just like some vague prophecy that exists from the mist of time and we don't know where it comes from. No, it was planted. There's this religious sort of women, the Bene Gesserit. I'm not really going to try to explain this book. I will never be done if I try and do that. So you're just going to have to go with me in terms of this, because, like, I feel like most people know the basics of this. House Atreides is sent to the planet Arrakis, which is a desert planet, also sometimes called Dune, where spice is mined. Spice is the fuel that allows for interstellar travel. It's incredibly important. They are ousting, by official imperial decree, the Harkonnens, who were in control of Arrakis, but it's actually a trap, and the Harkonnens are laying in wait to eradicate the Atreides. The son of the Duke, Paul Atreides, he escapes along with his mother and flees and joins with the Fremen, who are the locals, the natives on Arrakis, and ends up becoming basically their messiah. So that's the basic. And then, of course, deal with the Harkonnens, revenge, kind of takes over the entire empire by the end. But I'm not here to talk about the plot points. But coming back to the Chosen One there, the way that it's interesting is, like I said, the Bene Gesserit, this religious order that Paul's mother belongs to, deliberately planted these prophecies and these beliefs. And they've taken root on a number of planets. And the Bene Gesserit doesn't necessarily have total control over the way in which they take root, but they definitely planted them there. So by making the prophecy something that is there deliberately, as opposed to it's just a fact of the universe, which is the kind of nonsense I hate, this is more interesting. And also, Paul is suspected of possibly fulfilling this prophecy very early on. And so there's some conflict within him, like, am I? And then when he realizes, well, I'm going to try and be this, what is the best way for me to be this thing? He doesn't just assume because it's prophecy that everything will work out fine. He puts in a lot of work to get things done right. And that is a much more interesting way of dealing with the Chosen One in a prophecy than I've seen in a lot of books written since, which tend to just do it straightforward and bore the ever-loving crap out of me. There are some odd things about it that I'm going to bring up, but not necessarily as criticisms. I'm just not entirely sure how I feel about them. And again, most of this stuff is going to be somewhat reflective of the fact that it was written in the 60s. So it's well documented at this point that the vast majority of terminology, especially, and even some of the beliefs of the Fremen are derived and deliberately intended to resemble and or sound like beliefs and words and language from the Middle Eastern part of this planet, the sort of the Arabic world. And I have slightly mixed feelings about it. First of all, I'm in no position to say whether it uses these things respectfully. I have no idea. Like, it's possible it's disrespectful. It's possible it's seen as respectful. I don't know. What I will say is I am a little off put at just the general idea of using so many clear parallels to an actual real world culture, basically a shorthand for an alien culture, because that can contribute to sort of othering. That having been said, the Fremen are ultimately more heroic. They are the side we are meant to be rooting for. Yet at the same time, if you want to extrapolate, that does feasibly make Paul a white savior figure. I don't know. It's a bit mixed. It's not, like I said, it feels like someone with more knowledge of how it relates to the culture it borrowed from could say whether or not it's respectful. And honestly, I'd believe them either way. I could believe it's seen as respectful. I could believe it's seen as disrespectful. But I kind of felt like noting that. There's also the gender dynamics, which are more nuanced than a lot of stuff written in the 60s, for sure, but a little off. So like, take the Bene Gesserit, for example. They are obviously powerful. They do a lot of behind-the-scenes machinations. His mother is powerful, yet every man seems to deeply distrust them. Like, I think Paul's the only male character who doesn't, at some point, either in dialogue or in thought, think of the Bene Gesserit as witches. Not like in a, ooh, they can do magic, but like as a derogatory term. And so that, I was like, and his mother is shown to have some degree of power and, agency. But then once she and Paul escape the destruction of House Atreides, she becomes kind of useless for a while, especially when they're in the desert. Like, and I get that she doesn't have the training Paul does and the practical knowledge to be useful in the desert situation, but it also feels like she becomes a bit of a wet blanket. And, she feels like she kind of gives up and like, oh, no, this, like everything she thinks and does is like, well, no, that doesn't help. And it felt it felt a little out of character. Again, like to a certain degree, I get it. Because like she's stressed. Her lover just died. They're probably going to die out here. So like, I get it. It just pushed it to a degree that I'm like, this doesn't quite feel like the same character. And she's probably the female character with the most agency. Because there's also Chani, who is the Fremen who ultimately Paul has a child with. And Chani does not feel like a character we get to know very well at all. Actually, that's kind of true of most of the Fremen, other than Stilgar. They're treated as a collective, as opposed to a bunch of individuals, which brings me to another thing that is a little bit weird. So, I'm trying to think of the way to explain this. It threw me off how formalized the speech with the Fremen was. And not that this is necessarily a problem, and it is kind of justified, but I'll try to explain this. When we were dealing with House Atreides still standing, and, you know, we had the Duke, and we had basically the court, and all these people, like, I got why things were pretty formalized in terms of the way they talked, because there's, you know, sort of courtly etiquette kind of thing. Not to mention there was a lot of exposition, which it got away with because this family is coming to a new planet. They have a lot of questions to ask, and there's a lot of information to convey. And that actually worked for me very well. But then when Paul is with the Fremen, they also speak super formalized. Now there it's within the context of sort of religious observance as opposed to courtly etiquette, but it made them feel not particularly distinct from the very different people that we were dealing with in the first half of the book. Not that I'm saying like they should have been all like Cockney and you know, sort of this low speak and slang and stuff like that. I don't necessarily mean that, but it didn't feel distinguished. It just felt like the same kind of way of talking and being around each other, just justified by religious observance as opposed to courtly observances. And that felt a little off to me. I mean, I appreciate the fact that it's at least justified why they are behaving like this. But again, it was kind of too similar when I felt like there should have been a stronger distinction in terms of just the feel of the way these people are between the first half and the second. I'm not sure there is. Not nearly as much as I would have expected. There's one other female character I want to bring special attention to because I actually think that this was a fascinating way to deal with this. So there's a princess. This is the daughter of the emperor. And as far as her role in the story, she does nothing until the very end. She doesn't even exist in the story and the narrative until the very end. And she should have felt completely disconnected from everything. It should have been a whole like, what? Why are we introduced? What? But it doesn't, for a very interesting reason. Every single chapter of this book opens with a small quote from various texts written about Muad'Dib, which is one of the names that Paul goes by among the Fremen. It's sort of, for lack of a better term, his messianic name. And so these various books are written about the rise of Muad'Dib, the sayings of Muad'Dib, etc. These are all things written by the princess. And so she actually is a little bit of a presence through these excerpts that start off every chapter. And including some of those, she does talk a little bit about her own life under the emperor and does say some things about him. So we get insight and we get a feel for who she is as a person way before she gets introduced. Now, I'm not saying it might not have been a better idea to introduce her as an actual presence earlier, but if you're not going to do that, if you are going to bring her in just at the very end, that's a pretty fascinating way to not have it feel like it comes out of nowhere and means nothing. That's an interesting workaround. Props to that. I think the one other thing I'll say is that the tail end felt rushed. From about the time that like all the pieces are in place and everyone's like on the side that they're going to be on in this final conflict, the things barrel ahead very, very quickly. And again, part of that has to do with some of the time jumps that happen can make it feel a bit rushed. But you'll notice a lot of my stuff seems to be kind of like, this was weird or this is off. I want to stress, this is a good book. But because I already knew the narrative, there wasn't much for me to dig into to examine the narrative. I know the story. So for me, the way in which it was told is the much more interesting thing to talk about and examine. And like I said, it's fascinating. It's written in a very interesting way, in a very unique way that, again, I totally get why I didn't catch on and become a new normal, but it makes for an interesting reading experience. And actually, for me, a surprisingly fast one. It is pretty dense, and I mentioned when I read Accession that kind of slowed me down. This, and see, my eyes sort of zero in on dialogue. So when there is more dialogue, it makes it easier for me to get through something kind of quickly, whereas Accession was an awful lot of descriptions and only a few bits of dialogue here and there. So that was tougher for me to get through. This was for as long as it is a surprisingly breezy read. Oh, I should note, I did not read the appendices. I know there's like 100 or some odd pages of appendices, but I've said in other videos, I'm not actually really into lore. I'm into narrative and I'm into stories and the way stories are told. For me, appendices and lore, there are people who dig that and really want that additional information. That's awesome. It's there for if you want it. I don't engage with that kind of stuff, and it tends to read very dry, and it's the same reason I can't read like the Silmarils of J.R.R. Tolkien and stuff like that. It's just, it's lore dumps. I'm not interested in lore dumps. It's cool that Frank Herbert fleshed it out as much as he did to have all that stuff. And it's cool that he made it available since it didn't have a direct place in the narrative because it would have bogged it down even more. But I suppose I should put that out there. Didn't read the appendices. I never would have gotten through it. But that's Dune. Have you read it? What'd you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I got a Patreon. That is how I was commissioned to review this. And you can commission me too. But come on back and next, I think we'll talk about David Lynch and his attempt to crack this thing. See you then. And look at you, sticking around through the credits. I appreciate that. Well, you know what? You're about to be treated to a whole ton of names going by on the screen, but there's a few of them that I want to give special attention to. My special thanks to Bookworm, Jared Boyce, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edelin, Hannah Acker, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, and Shayla Gourlay. If you want to hear me mispronounce your name, check out the reward tiers on the Patreon. But for right now, thanks so much.